And so today I will be switching, as I saw that yesterday a lot of the talks were more about inorganic solar cells, so today I'll start talking about organics and talk in particular about how charges are generated in there. So instead of using inorganic semiconductors, it is possible to use organic ones, and although many people think, or it's often thought that plastics are non-conducting materials, it is actually possible to have organics that are semiconductors, such as molecular crystals, conjugated materials, or carbon nanotubes. And I'm actually most interested in the conjugated materials. And they have been used in a big variety of different applications, such as the ones we're interested in here today, so the solar cells, but also photodetectors, light-emitting diodes, lasers, field effect transistors, and some sensors. And in general, there are many advantages associated with them, such as low cost, energy efficient production and use, easy processing, often from solution, to make lightweight, large area and flexible films of those organic electronic devices. One of the drawbacks is that although they have been successfully used, they are not extremely well understood. So it's often some kind of blind trial and error development of the applications, and so the performance is not yet competitive with the inorganic counterparts, and more work needs to be done to understand what is really going on. There are also some issues with stability and lifetime, but which are being improved. So today about organic solar cells, so I'm sure that all of you know that, but I'll still make a brief introduction on that. You take a material such as a conjugated polymer, which will be your electron donor, and since it is soluble, you can mix it in solution with another material, and typically it's an electron acceptor that's a fullerene derivative like PCBM, and you mix them in a common solution. And then you cast this solution into a solid film, so either in the lab using something like spin coating, or either on industrial scale using something like roll-to-roll processing. And then you get this thin film, and when you look at it on a nanoscale or microscopic scale, you can see that it has a particular structure, which is often referred to as the bulk heterojunction, where you get this interpenetrating network of a polymer phase and a fullerene phase with a big surface area between the two of them. And this active layer of the polymer blended with the fullerene is then incorporated into a solar cell device, where you have a substrate which can be flexible or can just be glass. Then you have electrodes. One is transparent, ITO. The counter electrode can be aluminum or some other metal, and some interfacial layers to enhance the charge transport. And if you look into any textbook and how these solar cells work, you will most of the time see a picture like this, which tells you that you excite into your conjugated polymer phase. But since it's an organic semiconductor, not an inorganic one, if you just excite it, you don't automatically get charges. But you need charges to make a solar cell work. And therefore you have to use the trick. That's why you need to add the fullerene, because then this exciton, which doesn't have the free charges, will diffuse to an interface with the fullerene. And since the fullerene is an electron acceptor, it will then take an electron from the polymer, and you form what is known as a charge transfer state. So you get an electron and hole, but that are still somehow coulombically or through molecular overlap bound. And then this charge transfer state dissociates into free charges that can be transported in the phase segregated network to the opposite electrodes. And this is a very convenient picture to get an idea of what is going on, but it has a lot of shortcomings because it neglects a lot of important factors, such as the role of exciton diffusion, because the many reports in literature say that charges are formed extremely quickly in those bulk heterojunctions on a time scale of 45 femtoseconds, and nobody really explains how this can be, because exciton diffusion should be much slower. There are lots of questions about hot states, delocalization, about how the charge transfer state dissociates. I'll come back to that in a moment. What happens when you actually excite the fullerene and not the polymer? And maybe one of the most important factors that rules a lot the photophysics and rules all the other factors is the microstructure, because it's rarely the case that you really get a clean two-phase picture. So let me say a little bit more about these hot and delocalized states. So if I take the simple picture that I presented on the previous diagram and translate it into a free energy level diagram, so you get this picture of all the different electronic states. So the idea is that you excite your polymer, you go to the excited state, the S1 state, then you form the charge transfer state, and then the free charges. And it turns out that in conjugated polymers, there seems to be an effect that your exciton is quite delocalized at very, very early time scales. So just a few tens of femtoseconds after excitation, and that it then shrinks to an exciton on a fast time scale. So there has been some discussion in literature on whether actually the electron transfer to the fullerene can take place from higher lying, maybe delocalized states. So this is one point that's being investigated a lot. Another idea that has appeared a lot in literature is the idea that to dissociate the charge transfer state, you also go through some hot delocalized states, and that allows you to form free charges on a very fast time scale, as opposed to the case where you relax your charge transfer state and then you have to dissociate it working against the Coulomb attraction. And so there's been a lot of discussion about these things, which are not at all taken account by the simple picture, but which might be the factors that are really ruling how well your solar cell works or not. And then, as I said, there's this question of microstructure, which is the one I'll be talking about most today, because you don't really get this black and white picture. What you get is that you can have the polymer and the fullerene completely separated, but then your polymer can form all sorts of crystalline or amorphous phases, and depending on how the packing is, it can give a very rich, energetic landscape. But then most of the time, the fullerenes can actually really intermix with the polymer. So you can either get bicrystals where it's a crystalline mixed phase, or you can have fullerenes just mixing into some amorphous polymer parts. And this intermixing will really have a big effect on the photophysics, and you have a lot of different possibilities of having crystalline amorphous domains and intermixed regions, so you can get 4 or 5 different phases in your bulk heterojunction instead of just 2 as proposed in the initial picture. And so what we wanted to do is to understand a little bit better the effect of this microstructure on the photophysics, and also on these effects of hot states and what I talked about before. So what we use is ultra-fast spectroscopy. So just as a short introduction, we use different techniques of photocurrent measurements, where you have a solar cell and you just irradiate it and you look at the current coming out. And then this ultra-fast spectroscopy, and at the end of the talk I'll also show you some techniques where we mix the two. We excite the polymers or the solar cell with pulsed lasers, and then look at the effects on photocurrent and things like that. And what we always want to do, which makes sense because we are working with solar cells, is to look at the interaction between the solar cell, or just the material thin film on a glass slide, with light. But of course we don't work with the sun in the lab, but we replace the light source with a laser. And in this case, we're actually using femtosecond lasers. So they are lasers which actually bundle the light into extremely short pulses of the order of 100 femtoseconds. So 100 femtoseconds, that's really an extremely short time. So you see it here expressed in seconds. And so all the light is actually bundled into this very short pulse. And this is much better if you want to follow reactions that are happening in those materials, because if you just continuously irradiate and then you want to follow a reaction, you don't really have a clear start of your reaction and the stop of your reaction. But here, when you use this pulse laser, the fact that the material absorbs this pulse. Is like a start signal. Now we have excited it, and then we can follow in time what happens afterwards. And in order to follow that, one thing we do is to actually come in with a second laser beam, which is also pulsed, and we measure the absorption spectrum of the sample that has already been excited. And for example, that this is the case, I'll just, as an example, assume the case where you have a polymer fullerene blend and where the charge separation is very slow. And here, if we take the absorption spectrum of the excited sample just after excitation, you will see a typical signature in your spectrum, which is due to the exciton of the polymer. And then we actually measure the absorption spectrum again, but we come in with the pulse which reads the information a little bit later, and therefore we get another spectrum where now the signature of the exciton has gone down, but we have had some electron transfer to the fullerene, so we see a new signature due to the charges going up, and we continue this several times, and like this we can really follow the dynamics of the exciton decay and the charges appearing. And so this is how we follow the reactions that take place in those polymer fullerene blends. And actually we don't just do it in the visible range, but we combine a lot of different experiments. For example, instead of measuring the absorption spectrum of your excited sample, we can measure the infrared spectrum to look at the vibrations. We can do terahertz spectroscopy, so this is the far infrared, and this will also give you information about the mobility of your charges. We can look at field effects if we work in solar cells. I'll tell you more about that later. And we can also probe with photocurrent instead of probing with lasers. And in general, I always feel that it's a very good idea to use many complementary techniques to really compare the results, because you get a much more rounded and much clearer picture than if you just use one technique. So let me now come to the results. So we investigated two systems. One comes from Canada here, actually in a collaboration with Maria Leclerc. It's called PVD-TTPD. And it's actually a very, very good solar cell material. It can get up to 8.5% efficiency. And it's known that it has a three-phase microstructure from an independent X-ray diffraction study. So you have pure polymer aggregates, then you have some fullerene clusters, and you also have some regions where the polymer and the fullerene are intimately mixed. So we have three different phases here. It's also a polymer I like a lot because it's quite planar in the ground and excited states. So in general, it favors delocalization effects and avoids self-trapping effects, which can be bad. And we also collaborated a little bit with Jean Fréchet at KAUST, who provided the same polymer but with different side chains here. And by varying the side chains, we could look at the effect of the packing in the pure polymer domains on the photophysics and find out more things. We then studied the second polymer, which is PB-TTT, which is actually not known so much for its solar cells, but it's more known for its transistors because it has extremely high mobility and extremely good packing, and some call it crystallinity of the polymer. But it's still very interesting to study it in conjunction with fullerenes, because the fullerenes can actually intercalate here between the side chains of the polymer, forming extremely well-defined bicrystals. And so we have an excellent control over the microstructure, either by playing with the concentration of the fullerenes or also by using some processing additives, which we did in collaboration with Professor Natalie Stingelin at Imperial College. And so let me start now with the results on the first polymer, the one with the high solar cell efficiency. So here you just have the steady state absorption and emission spectra. So in blue it's the absorption spectrum of the polymer. It's quite structured. In red you have the blend with the fullerene, and in black you have just the fullerene, and you can basically see that the blend is the composite of the other two. So it's really a mixture. In here you have the emission spectrum of the pure polymer, the neat polymer, and you can see that the Stokes shift between absorption and emission is actually very small, and this is, as I said, a sign that this polymer has very little relaxation, is very planar in both the ground and excited state, as I mentioned before. Then we did this pump probe spectroscopy, and this is just the neat polymer. So in the neat polymer, we mainly expect to see the exciton. And so what you see in this is a signal that's negative, and that's called the ground state bleaching. And it's actually very similar to the steady state absorption spectrum. And the ground state bleaching, if it's there, it just tells you that your sample has been excited. So you're not in the ground state anymore. So this, as long as you see this negative signal resembling the steady state absorption, you know that your system is either in the excited state or has formed charges or has formed the triplet state, but anything else than the ground state. Then we see a little bit of a signal which is also negative and which resembles the steady state emission, and that's the stimulated emission. And that basically tells you that you have the exciton, because charges and triplet states, they won't have this signature. So here we can actually learn whether we have the exciton or not and see what happens to the exciton. And then this exciton will also absorb some light, and so you get a positive signature, which is called excited state absorption, for example, and where you can really then have the absorption spectrum of the exciton. And one thing we noticed, but I'll just show it, but we're not exactly clear about the reason, is that this excited state absorption actually extends extremely far into the infrared range. So it seems that the exciton really has a very broad excited state absorption, and this could be representative of some manifold of higher lying delocalized states, that we're still working on this effect. But now back to the visible range, we then blended in the fullerene. And then we see a change in the spectrum. We still see the ground state bleaching because we're still not back in the ground state. What happens when we put the fullerene is that we form charges. But then we don't have the exciton anymore, so this stimulated emission has actually disappeared because it's been quenched, excited state. And instead we get a new signature with a peak at 880 nanometers, which is very nicely characteristic, and which tells us that we have formed charges. And so the experiment that we did was to excite at two different excitation wavelengths. So once we excited here at 390 nanometers, that there's a lot of absorption by the fullerene. And so we wanted to find out what happens when in the blend you excite the fullerene instead of the polymer. And then we excited more here, where we excite mainly the polymer. And then we looked at these transient absorption spectra at different time delays after the excitation. And the first observation that we made is that this characteristic peak that's due to the charges, it's already there at very early time delays, and that shows us what literature usually says, that there is some prompt, very fast generation of charges, which happens faster than the time resolution of our experiments. But additionally to that, we also saw that there is some slower rise of this peak due to charges. So there's also some delayed charge generation. And when we excited at 390 nanometers, what's happening at the same time is a little bit different, because you see a rise of the ground state bleaching of the polymer, but when you excite the polymer, you actually see something different. You see a decay of the stimulated emission. And from that, we concluded that we can actually generate the charges even in very similar yield, either by what you typically see in literature, electron transfer after exciting the polymer, but we can also form it by hole transfer after exciting the fullerene, and the yield seems to be quite similar. And so the next thing we wanted to do is to actually get an idea of the time scales that are involved with those more delayed electron and hole transfer processes. So we looked at all the dynamics of the transient absorption, and so don't worry if you don't understand the details, but we did something called a global analysis. So we looked at the evolution of the entire spectrum, and first we just modeled it with a sum of exponential functions. And although this doesn't have a direct physical meaning, we could see already that we get a component of about 1 picosecond, which was clearly associated with the electron transfer, because in this is called an amplitude spectrum, so it's the pre-exponential factors as a function of wavelengths. We could see a decay of the stimulated emission of the excited state absorption, the rise of the charge peak. So it was extremely clear that this is due to the electron transfer. And then we saw a much slower component due to the hole transfer, which actually became more important the more we excited in the blue, the more we excited the fullerene. And again, it was very clear to assign this to hole transfer. And then we saw some signature due to long-lived charges. But since sometimes this exponential model doesn't have so much physical meaning, we also developed a kinetic model which really took into account the evolution of all the different species, and the information we got from this more complicated analysis is very similar. You get a delayed electron transfer, which is still quite fast, 1 picosecond time scale, and delayed hole transfer, which is much slower, which occurs more on the 100 picosecond time scale, and which is slightly multiphasic. And we were actually very proud because, as I said, we always like to confirm our results with other techniques. And in this case, we used terahertz spectroscopy. And it's very challenging to do terahertz spectroscopy in a good way on these conjugated polymers because the signals are very small, and therefore you either need to excite with a very strong intensity, but then this can actually falsify the information you get out of it. So we used extremely low excitation fluence, and we accumulated for 4 days to get this data. And what we see is that there is actually a slow rise due to the delayed electron transfer, so we could confirm that we can also see this with terahertz spectroscopy. The next thing, what we wanted to do is to actually know how much of the electron or of the charge separation is prompt, because I said some of it already occurs on a very, very fast time scale, faster than our experimental resolution, and how much is delayed and occurs by these 1 and 100 picosecond time scales that I showed on the previous slide. So what we did here was to take the transient absorption spectra at the earliest time delay that we could resolve, and then we took the spectral signatures of the charges and of the exciton in the polymer and of the exciton in the fullerene, and we just decomposed those spectra into a linear combination of the three. And what we found from that is that actually the amount of charges that are formed promptly, it's always about 25% independently of the excitation wavelengths. So it doesn't matter whether we excited the fullerene or the polymer, we always got 25% of prompt charge separation and 75% of the more delayed processes. We did a similar analysis on the spectrum at very long time delays, and we found that we always get about 80% of long-lived charges. It's again independent of the excitation wavelengths. So this confirms a lot of studies that you see right now where you get flat IQE curves across the whole spectrum, so you don't seem to see an intense wavelength effect on the yield of your charges. But it's not just the overall yield of the charges, but also the yield of promptly generated charges, which is independent of wavelengths. And we were a little bit surprised by that, because when you use a shorter wavelength, so more energy, you don't just excite the fullerene, but you can also excite the polymer, but in higher lying excited states. So you can, in principle, get this hot exciton dissociation. And we did some polarization sensitive measurements, and I'm not going to go into the detail, but these polarization sensitive measurements seem to show that there is a little bit of hot exciton dissociation. So it is possible that the electron transfers to the fullerene before the excited state has relaxed. But nevertheless, even if it happens, it doesn't seem to influence the yield of your prompt charges or of your overall charges that are generated here. But then we actually wanted to, we suspected that those different time scales that we see are related to the microstructure, and therefore we wanted to get an idea, a rough idea of the distances involved here. So we started playing with annihilation effects, because that's actually something that's making the studies quite challenging, but here we used it in a positive way, is that when you use high intensities with your laser, you generate a lot of excitons in your material, and then those excitons can actually encounter, and when they encounter, annihilate. So you lose excitons, so you recover the ground state, and this is something that wouldn't occur in the typical solar cell because the solar intensity is so much lower. So you always have to be very careful when you do pulsed experiments to avoid those effects. But in our case, we actually used them, and so we looked at we increased the intensity, and we wanted to find out, starting at which density of populating the excitons we start seeing annihilation effects on the 100 femtosecond time scale. So these are annihilation effects that are practically static. And we saw that this happens when the excitons are about 2 nanometers apart. So excitons that are 2 when we populate so many excitons that they're 2 nanometers apart, they can annihilate themselves very quickly without diffusing. And so we have a rough idea that the size of the excitons is about 2 nanometers. And then we started looking at when does this annihilation compete with the delayed electron transfer. And we found a distance of about 4 nanometers. So it's a very rough indication, because the distance dependence of electron transfer and annihilation can be slightly different, but it's just to get a rough idea of the distances involved here. So we think that an exciton needs to diffuse about 4 nanometers before a delayed electron transfer step. And then we actually collaborated with Jean Fréchet and looked at the different side chains, and it turns out that when you take this polymer with different side chains, you get a very big variation in the solar cell efficiency, and this is mainly due to packing effects. So when you get the P3, which is the one I've shown until now, you actually get the most planar chains, and you get the best packing, and it really reflects in the solar cell efficiency. And so we did the transient absorption on those different samples, and actually what we found is that there are not very large differences on the time scales that we are measuring. So we are measuring between 100 femtoseconds and 1 nanosecond, and so whatever causes this big variation doesn't happen on the fast time scale. It should be more related to transport or things that are happening slower than what we measure. And in particular, this 1 picosecond delayed electron transfer was not affected by the packing, and from that we concluded that basically the exciton is reaching a fullerene through the polymer chain and doesn't jump from one chain to the others, because the rate of this is not affected by the packing on the 1 picosecond time scale. And to confirm that, we also used some shorter polymer chains and some well, actually the first one, which does where even the chains themselves are less planar, and here we saw that we could actually delay a little bit more this electron transfer. So we think it's mainly intramolecular. And from all this information, we actually drew a cartoon. So we formulated this into a picture. And so what we said is that the dynamics are really related to the microstructure. So the prompt charge generation that we see occurs in the intermixed regions. So it doesn't matter whether you excite the polymer or the fullerene, your charge separation is always very fast. It's faster than 100 femtoseconds because you don't need any exciton diffusion. Your polymer and fullerene are in contact. And actually an X-ray diffraction study showed that you get about 20-25% of this intermixed phase, and this correlates very well with the 25% of charge separation which we saw here. So it doesn't depend on any hot effects, the yield of this, but it's really limited by the amount of intermixed phase that you get. And then we said that the more delayed electron and hole transfer processes occur from the pure regions of polymer and fullerene, where the exciton actually needs to diffuse to a charge separation site. But still, from this annihilation study, we could tell that the polymer domains are about 8 nanometers large, and it's still very fast to consider that an exciton can diffuse over 4 nanometers in 1 picosecond. And so probably what is happening is that this exciton is quite delocalized, about 2 nanometers, and it can reach a fullerene by a single hopping step along the same polymer chain. This explains why this process can be very fast. However, once you're in the fullerene clusters, it probably takes several hops, about even coupled fullerenes, but it's probably a little bit slower, just the transport of the fullerene excitons to an interface, and that's why we see something much slower and multiphasic. But still, although there are all those different pathways, electron hole transfer, hot or not hot, mixed or pure regions, overall we always generated charges in almost quantitative yield. So this particular blend is extremely robust to different charge separation pathways, and it's probably one of the reasons why this polymer actually gives such a high efficiency. Now I want to say a few words about the second material that we investigated, which is this PB-TTT. And so here we collaborated with Natalie Stingelin, and so this one you can really control the microstructure. For example, if you just add the polymer and fullerene in a 1-to-1 ratio, you will have all the fullerenes that go inside your polymers and form those well-defined bicrystals. In this case, when you measure the solar cell, it's actually a really bad solar cell, this particular mixture. Then you can add more fullerene, and so since all the places inside the polymer are already filled up, the excess fullerene will form clusters around it. So here you get two phases. You get one phase which are the intermixed bicrystals, and one phase where you have extra fullerenes clustering around it. And this gives the best solar cell efficiency. So the fact that you have those pure fullerene domains seems to help the efficiency. And then there's the possibility to add those additives with different alkyl chain lengths, and this can be added to the 1-to-1 blend, and it will cause the fullerenes to move out of the polymers. And so here you can also get some pure polymer phase, which you don't get in the two other cases. So you can either partially or completely deintercalate the fullerenes, and this typically allows to increase a little bit the solar cell efficiency of the 1-to-1 blend, although it doesn't get as good as the 1-to-4 blend. And so we wanted to understand a little bit more what's going on. So we did again the transient absorption spectroscopy, and I started with the two that were already well studied and a little bit more known, which are the 1-to-1 and 1-to-4 blends. And we did again the study where we excited either more into the fullerene or more into the polymer. And we found that in the 1-to-1 blend, so where all the fullerenes are intercalated, where we don't really see much changes to the spectrum, and the spectrum that we get even at very early time delays is immediately due to charges. So we generate charges promptly in this blend, which makes a lot of sense given what I showed for the previous polymer, because there is just no exciton diffusion necessary, and there's this proximity between the polymer and fullerene, so all the charge separation is really, really fast. But then what we see is that the signal almost disappears on the 1 nanosecond time scale. And that's because in this blend, what seems to happen is that you transfer your electron to your fullerene, but then your electron and hole, they kind of stay in a charge transfer state or something where they interact, and then they just recombine to the ground state. And so you lose all your charges on a very fast time scale of less than 1 nanosecond, and that's why your solar cell just works so badly, because you never get time to get the charges out of your solar cell. They just recombine after being formed. Then we looked at the 1-to-4 blend, which gives this much better solar cell efficiency. And here, when we excited the polymer, we immediately saw again the signature of the charges with this peak here. And so it makes sense because all the polymers are still close to fullerene. So again, all the electron transfer is prompt. However, when we excited into the fullerenes, we saw also partly some slower rise of the ground state bleaching of the polymer. So we saw some delayed hole transfer, and this made again perfect sense in view of the microstructure, because now partly we excite into those pure fullerene clusters, and so again it takes some time for the excitons in these fullerene clusters to reach a polymer. This explains the slightly slower hole transfer that we see here. But what's the really interesting message is that you don't see this fast decay of the signal. There is a little bit of decay of the system, but it's much better than in the 1-to-1 blend. And so what's already also been reported by other people is that really the fact that you have the pure fullerene cluster somehow seems to help to dissociate this state, and it prevents this fast geminate recombination, and therefore you can get many more charges out, and you get a much better solar cell efficiency. And we could confirm all of this also by studying the dynamics, and we did again a global analysis and things like that, but I'm not going to go into the details. Then we looked a little bit into the blends with those processing additives, and very briefly, so the first thing we saw is that when we just looked at the signal of the transient absorption, so here it's just in a band of the charges, we could see that the solar cell efficiency really correlates to the amount of signal that we had at long time delays. So it really, what limits the efficiency in those systems is really the loss of charges or excitons on the fast less than 1 nanosecond time scale. And I already showed you before that in the 1-to-1 and 1-to-4 blend, this loss is mainly due to geminate recombination. And this geminate recombination in the blends with the additives, it was better. So we could suppress it a little bit by having, again, the pure regions, because we de-intercalated the fullerenes. However, we ended up with quite big domains of pure polymer, and we actually saw the signature of the excitons, which we also see in the pure polymer, which just stayed there and decayed in the same way they would in the pure polymer. And this means that somehow the excitons that we generated in the pure polymer regions, they never reached the fullerene. So we actually had a lot of recombination of the excitons here, and we didn't get a complete yield of the charge separation. So what's limiting the solar cells with the additives is really probably the size or the exciton transport, which is not efficient because maybe the pure domains are too large, or the exciton transport is just not good enough. And so finally, I just want to give a little bit of outlook on a new experiment that we've started doing actually just in the last month or so. So what I'm going to say is very tentative, and I don't have a complete interpretation for everything. But what came out of this study, and what people also notice, or a lot in general, is that it's really important to understand how this charge transfer state, well, if it exists, and how it dissociates. And there are those two competing views. One says that the charge transfer state dissociates very quickly, going through hot states. And then there is another school which says the charge transfer state dissociates very slowly, and you don't need any hot states in the charge transfer state. And this is something that's very difficult to study using transient absorption spectroscopy, because here we always see the signature of charges, so we know whether the electron has been transferred to the fullerene, but we don't know whether the hole and the electron are still feeling each other, are still close by, or whether they are completely dissociated into free charges. And that's why we had to change technique. And we decided not to do those studies anymore on just the thin film of the material on a glass slide, which we did so far, but to actually work with entire solar cells. And this can be done with pump probe spectroscopy, but it's not transient spectroscopy anymore, because you can't transmit through the sample, because there is the aluminum electrode which blocks your light. But we can just reflect the probe beam off this aluminum electrode, and we can measure the same thing as with transient absorption spectroscopy, but on the entire solar cell. But an advantage of having the solar cell is that now you have contacts, and so you can apply an external electric field. And it turned out that with PBTTT, when you apply an electric field, there is a shift of the steady-state absorption spectrum. This is called the Stark effect. And what we measured is actually the difference. Here it's very subtle. I even exaggerated it here. But what we measured with very sensitive CCD cameras is the difference of the absorption spectrum with and without the applied electric field. So we applied this in reverse bias to get a homogeneous field across the device. And we get this different spectrum, which is called an electroabsorption. And we could see this electroabsorption actually in the pure PCBM, that's known, but also in the pure polymer, and in all the different blends we saw a big signature due to this electroabsorption. And it's quite interesting, because the shape of this depends a lot on the microstructure, so we're still analyzing the precise origin of this, but most of the time we actually got an electroabsorption that varies quadratically with the applied electric field, and so we have here a quadratic Stark effect. And we decided to use this Stark effect to learn something about the separation of the charge transfer state. And so we did, we added a additional complexity to this experiment, we measured the electroabsorption, and then we actually excited the sample with a pump. And we saw that at different times after the excitation by the pump, there is a small reduction of this electroabsorption signal. So what happens here is that when we excite with the pump, we generate charges. And then those charges, well, as long as they are bound in the charge transfer state, they don't really create any net electric field. But then if the charge transfer state has dissociated into free charges, and those free charges actually start moving to opposite electrodes in the direction of the, well, in the plane of the applied electric field, then they will shield the applied electric field. And so the net electric field felt by the polymer that we're looking at gets smaller because we're generating those free charges. And that's why the electroabsorption decreases. And by following the dynamics of the net electric field that the polymer sees, so the applied field minus the field that is screening due to the generation of charges, we therefore have a way to watch the drift of charges apart. And this is something that now allows us to be more selective to the free charges, because only free charges will contribute to this effect. And so this is why we saw actually a big decrease of this electroabsorption when we went to the 1-to-4 blend, which generates a lot of free charges because there's not so much geminate recombination, compared to the 1-to-1 blend, where where there's a lot of geminate recombination, so we don't generate so many free charges. And in the pure polymer, you hardly generate any charges, so you don't see a big effect. So we now have something more selective to free charges and something that allows to see how they're moving apart. And then we actually wanted to compare the dynamics of this, so what causes it. And what we noticed is that for all the different blends, so the 1-to-1, the 1-to-4, the additives, although the amplitude of the effect really depends a lot on the microstructure. Once we normalized the effect at long time delays, we didn't really see any difference. So what seems to happen is that the microstructure can affect how many free charges you get, but then the mechanism by which they are formed, the ones that escape, seems to be very similar in the different signals. So it's possible that that's because they are all formed already on a very fast time scale before what we are measuring here. Now we are still trying to find out the precise origin of this dynamics, which has a few picosecond components and a slower component. So this is ongoing work, and I hope to tell you more about that in the future. But one encouraging thing that we noticed is that even by looking simply at the transient absorption spectra and by doing a global analysis, we found one component in the 2.4 picosecond component in the global analysis, which is very similar to the first derivative of the absorption spectrum and also very similar to the electroabsorption spectrum. So this is an effect that we can see even without applying an electric field. So this is not something that we are artificially creating with the field. And so now we have two ways to actually get this electroabsorption, either by normal transient absorption, where it's complicated by spectral overlap, or by this specific Stark spectroscopy. We're now developing a model to combine the two results and to understand this dissociation of the charge transfer state much better. So in conclusion, I showed a lot of spectroscopic data, but now if somebody asks me whether this is really useful and whether this can really improve the performance of solar cells, I would give the following answer on how to make a good solar cell. So I would say that you should always aim for a low band gap to improve your light harvesting. But what's very important when you aim for this low band gap is that you don't sacrifice the delocalization that you can get in your polymer. So you should always be careful that your charges and your excitons remain sufficiently delocalized. You should have rigid polymers, because when they kind of twist and change conformation in the excited state, that can really self-trap your excitons, and this can lead to certain problems. So always aim for something rigid with a small Stokes shift between absorption and emission, for example. I don't think that ultra-fast charge separation is necessary. One of the best solar cell materials, the PB, or the one I talked about, sorry, that's that only has 25% of ultra-fast charge separation, and it still works very quickly, very well and very efficiently. So you don't need this 45 femtosecond charge separation. It's just something that happens if you have intermixed regions. The pure domains, however, seem to be important, and there's one question, which is, do we need pure fullerene domains, or do we need pure polymer domains, or do we need both? And I think it depends a little bit on the particular polymer that you have. If the polymer has a good short-range mobility, the pure polymer domains can probably help the dissociation, but if the mobility is not so good in the polymer, maybe you need the pure fullerene domain. So I think the ideal microstructure really depends on your electronic properties of your particular blend. But it's always important that your pure domains are sufficiently small that you quench all your excitons. This is something that doesn't seem to happen in the PB/TTT with the processing additives. Good packing is an advantage, especially for the transport, but crystallinity is not something necessary in solar cells. The best ones are typically not very crystalline. It might even be a disadvantage for your bimolecular recombination. But what's usually important is to have long polymer domains, chains, high molecular weight, because probably most of the exciton transport to a fullerene, and maybe even some of the charge transport, is dominated by what happens within the chains. So a high molecular weight, I would say, is important for exciton and charge transport. And with that, I would actually like to thank my team. So I have Maria-Teresa, who is my PhD student, who did a lot of the transient absorption spectroscopy, and who is now actually moving into terahertz spectroscopy, and she worked together with Jan, who I hired for a short time as a postdoc, and who is very good with terahertz techniques. Arun worked also with transient absorption spectroscopy in the first polymer that I showed. Then I actually use all the equipment of the group of Professor Jacques Moser. So I want to thank him for this, and some of the people in his group, in particular Yelissa, helped a lot with the transient Stark effect measurements, and Ahmad participates with the terahertz measurements because he knows the setup very well. I would really like to thank collaborators for materials, because I don't synthesize any polymers myself, so I'm always dependent on getting good materials, and so I'm really grateful to, for example, Mario Leclerc for sending me polymers, and also for Natalie Stingelin for those wonderful materials with morphology control, and Jean Fréchet for the different sidechain derivatives. We have a network called NCCR MUST in Switzerland, where all the ultra-fast spectroscopists come together, and I could collaborate in there for some of the measurements. And finally, I want to thank the Swiss National Science Foundation for funding. They've been great with this. And as a short announcement, as Carlos mentioned, I just got a position at the University of Fribourg, so I have open positions. So if you're interested, please don't hesitate to look at my webpage and